Good morning, kia ora. Bonjour, Anishinaabe. Ginui kwe nindishtikaz. Ginu nindudem. Kiwana gichigumi nindu jiba. Musquiam ninda. Nidichi nindam na ba nan. Chi miigwech. I start with kia ora, but then I greeted you and introduced myself in my Anishinaabe Ojibwe language. So let me repeat in English what I said. I said, good day, friends, hello. My name is Golden Eagle Woman, and I come from the Eagle Clan. My home community is at Kiwana Bay on the lake called Gichigumi, which the English call Lake Superior. I live on the territory of the Musqueam Nation in what the English call Vancouver. I am absolutely delighted to be here today, and I thank you very much for this honor. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge and honor the Maori people of this land on whose territory we are meeting today. And many, many thanks to the organizers of the conference, and Mark and Victoria Law for inviting me here today. And thank you so much for the warm welcome and greeting this morning. It's absolutely a distinct pleasure and privilege for me to be here this morning. Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Wellington in particular have formed what I would call a substantial part of my research projects in the past and will always hold a very special place in my heart. So I thank you this morning. As Mark said, I'm a political scientist. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a legal scholar. So I come here this morning with a little bit of imposter syndrome. I'm addressing you from the perspective of an Indigenous, specifically Anishinaabe or Ojibwe, political scientist of international relations from North America. So in my time this morning, I'd like to speak just a bit about how I view Indigenous rights as potentially paving what I see as a revolutionary, or perhaps we could call it more evolutionary path towards an entirely new future in law, governance, and in our societies. But it's a future that ultimately requires substantial effort from all of us to think outside existing boxes. So just a few notes about who I am and where I come from to give you a better sense of my perspective. As mentioned, I'm a research professor at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and I bring a picture just to show you that it's not such a bad place to work and hang out from day to day. Its beauty is rivaled only by New Zealand, in my humble opinion. While I'm also appointed in political science, as Mark said, I mainly work in the First Nations and Indigenous Studies program at UBC, which I would describe as a theoretically rigorous, research and community-based undergraduate program within the arts faculty of UBC. And we've also launched the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies recently, which is made up of both First Nations Indigenous Studies and First Nations Endangered Languages program together. And my faculty colleagues that are shown here come from a number of Indigenous nations across North America. We have Lakota, Cherokee, Dene, Nuchalnuth, Kwakiwak, and then two of us are Anishinaabe. As is the protocol here, in Western Canada, we always honor and acknowledge the people of the territory where we live, work, and meet. So I have to acknowledge that for the past 7 years, I have been honored to be living and working at UBC, and I've done so on the territory of the Musqueam Nation. So I want to thank them for their never-ending hospitality and ongoing support of us and all of our students. I am Anishinaabe, and while Anishinaabe, and sometimes called Ojibwe, is one of the largest indigenous nations in North America, and Anishinaabe people come from a large swath of territory that spans from the eastern Great Lakes as far west as the state of Montana, my people in particular come from the Great Lakes region, especially around Lake Superior. So the close-up on the right shows some of the Anishinaabe communities around the lake, and mine is one on the southern shore of Lake Superior at Kiwana Bay. We are an Algonquin-speaking people, what they describe as a woodlands nation, and these are just some examples of our traditional clothing that are worn at contemporary cultural events, and these are actually photos of members of my extended family. As an academic, I've been trained in the discipline of political science, particularly in international relations, which I do approach from a very critical perspective. And as is often discussed in critical circles, the discipline of international relations, like many other very conservative academic disciplines, does have a set of enshrined fundamental assumptions that Indigenous people view as highly problematic. Presumptions about the state, about liberalism, and about human rights, all of which combine to mask or erase certain sets of problematic power relations and overlook, silence, or as I say, completely erase Indigenous peoples, our political orders, and our ways of living and being in the world, and also how we view the international. However, in recent years, there's been an opening, what I see as a new energy that's pushing for inclusion of Indigenous peoples and worldviews, and also respect for Indigenous peoples' rights. So while I think this is a hopeful turn towards a more humane and just global future, I also want to spend some time discussing why I think it is ultimately so very challenging to do so, and how, if we collectively take a new path seriously, we will all be transformed over time. Then I want to close my remarks today by highlighting some of the recent activity in Canada that may be important steps in this direction. While Indigenous peoples are often dismissed as marginal non-state actors, and Indigenous rights are cast off as merely aspirational and non-binding human rights, I argue in my recent book quite a contrary position. The title of the book, as Mark mentioned, is Global Indigenous Politics, A Subtle Revolution, and in it, I argue that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is something much more than just a new set of rights and a new set of norms emerging and diffusing on the global stage in an ordinary manner, but rather, they actually represent what I call a potential moment of revolutionary transformation in global politics, but for the most part, overlooked and certainly underappreciated. The body of Indigenous political and legal theory that has emerged and blossomed since the 1980s speaks directly to the colonial assumptions of international politics. And it intervenes in openings previously provided by post-colonial scholarship of recent decades. Examining international politics through the lens of Indigenous political theory has revealed what I call a problematic global state of incomplete post-coloniality. This is a result of the institutional, the structural, the exclusion and erasure of Indigenous peoples in existing systems of governance. So what Indigenous political and legal theory have been calling for in post-colonial completion is Indigenous inclusion and accommodation. The challenge, however, is that that inclusion and accommodation is not so easy, and ultimately is going to force a major rethinking of such what I call small things as the state, decolonization, liberalism, diplomacy, and even Westphalian sovereignty. So in my time this morning, I want to put forward two arguments related to Indigenous rights. The first is a semi-controversial one, but I'm going to state my perspective on it. The UN Declaration, or UN DRIP as it is very unaffectionately known for short, was a significant global achievement because it represents what I say is an often overlooked and underappreciated transformational moment in global politics. From its earliest beginnings, the Indigenous rights movement at the United Nations, simply by seeking the international recognition of Indigenous rights, by definition, sought a set of fundamental transformative changes in the UN, the human rights system, and the wider international system. Some of these changes are very small and inconsequential, but some of them are much larger and what I call subtly revolutionary. For the Indigenous rights regime, as articulated in the UN GRIP, does not merely add new rights for Indigenous peoples to the international human rights consensus, it actually challenges some fundamentals of the human rights system. The second argument follows from the first. Because of what I see as the transformative nature of Indigenous rights, the real potential of the Declaration lies in how it will be implemented. In other words, the potential lies in its potential. And the real potential that I see within the implementation of Indigenous rights necessarily involves significant global change. Pardon me, technical issue. I posit that the Declaration and Indigenous rights represent three fundamental global changes, not only to the rights of Indigenous peoples specifically, but also to the conduct and function of a wider global politics. So the first change to be noted is adoption of the Declaration represented the very first time that a broad set of collective rights was accepted by every nation on earth within the human rights consensus. Again, the Indigenous rights movement has asserted from the beginning of its efforts at the UN that an exclusively individual rights framing of human rights was and remains insufficient to accommodate Indigenous peoples' rights. Indigenous peoples also need protections as collectives, as groups, especially in the area of cultural and land rights, and of course, political self-determination. The UK and the United States, along with other countries like Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, have all expressed long-standing concerns about incompatibility between collective and individual rights, arguing that recognition of collective rights leaves individuals within groups vulnerable and without the protection provided by individual human rights. Indigenous activists from this movement have widely reported that throughout the Cold War years, the United States always opposed any international instrument that included collective rights, out of the fear that collective rights represented some part of the global communist agenda. So when the UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights, broad statement supporting collective rights, passed by the overwhelming majority in the General Assembly, voted on by the United Kingdom, and then later endorsed by the United States, was clearly an important transitional moment in post-Cold War politics. The United States' endorsement of the Declaration even included a specific statement in support of collective rights, the first time that the United States has ever done so. Second change. The UN Declaration morally and politically corrects discriminatory legal exclusions of Indigenous people from the global decolonization project. Again, these have been efforts ongoing since the beginning of the Indigenous rights movement at the United Nations. Attack on what we would call the legal foundations of some settler states, the doctrine of discovery and the saltwater thesis exclusion of decolonization. The doctrine of discovery, of course, originates from the papal bulls and justified European discovery, claim, and exertions of sovereignty over essentially all non-European lands and peoples on Earth. The saltwater thesis, for those of you who may not be familiar with the UN decolonization project, I'll take a moment to elaborate. In 1960, the United Nations officially delegitimized colonial rule with its declaration on the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples. While this 1960 declaration proclaimed that all peoples on Earth have the right of self-determination, it did not define peoples or offer any guidance on how to determine who was actually eligible for decolonization. So a conflict immediately rose between proponents of what was at the time called the Belgian thesis who argued that all peoples, including those colonized within states, were entitled to the right of self-determination, while proponents of the alternative, which eventually was called the saltwater or blue water thesis, argued that only non-contiguous colonial territories, those located over salt water, were eligible for decolonization. So the saltwater thesis found support among a very strange coalition of the settler colonial states of the Western Hemisphere, joined by Australia and New Zealand, and the Socialist Bloc, which considered the Belgian thesis a direct attack on the multi-ethnic Soviet Union. As a consequence, given this unusual marriage, the saltwater thesis prevailed in the decolonization project, thus defining peoples eligible for decolonization and ultimately self-determination exclusively as those living in overseas colonies only, thus legally excluding indigenous peoples from decolonization and giving them a second-class or reduced human right of self-determination. So the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the indigenous rights discourse in general works to delegitimize both of these principles in international law, and technically, I underscore technically, corrects these discriminatory exclusions, although the question of how this is to be accomplished remains an ongoing item of negotiation on the global level and within affected domestic contexts. Third change. The international indigenous rights movement sought and achieved, through the UN Declaration, a guiding framework for indigenous state relationships based on a new and emerging, and so far not well understood, understanding of self-determination. Article 3 of the UN Declaration states that indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination, equal to all other peoples on Earth. But at the same time, the UN Declaration also offers protections for existing state sovereignty and territorial integrity in Article 46. As a side note, this Article 46 is one that the indigenous activists at the UN had no role in drafting or including in the UN Declaration and never consented to it, although in the end they did not officially oppose it either. And with the decolonization project of overseas colonies through the United Nations, largely, though not entirely completed, the open global question now is, what does self-determination exactly mean moving forward from here? If it truly means something other than sovereign, independent, territorial statehood, then what does it mean? According to the text of the UN Declaration, indigenous peoples' self-determination means that they have, quote, the right to freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. And it is said to include multiple possibilities, including self-government, autonomy, and even various types of political engagement with the state. The Declaration does not include any universal prescriptive solution for what self-determination should mean in practice. In fact, we could say the Declaration is the antithesis of a universal prescriptive solution. Rather, it provides space and expectations for negotiation of a multitude of political arrangements, with stated options ranging from autonomy and self-government to participation within the state, although we can assume that many other options can come to exist in a future imagining of what shared sovereignty or shared power can look like. The wider implication of all this is that self-determination from this moment forward can mean and will mean something other than sovereign statehood. The meaning of that and decolonization are continuing to evolve on the global level, and I see that indigenous rights and the discourse associated with it have a crucial role to play in this global conversation around that evolution. And in fact, though largely underappreciated, I think in many ways indigenous rights are leading that global conversation. This is a graphic taken directly from my book, which visually shows Indigenous rights as global change, but also shows us where the biggest challenges are. So prior to the passage of the Declaration in 2007, international human rights law and discourse excluded the two elements that are critical for Indigenous peoples. As mentioned earlier, the international human rights regime did not at that point include collective rights broadly to maintain such things as culture, language, religion, identity, or educational systems in the face of assimilative pressures. These rights, which I call soft rights, are indicated in the box with the rounded corners. Secondly, as also mentioned, Indigenous peoples' self-determination and their collective right to maintain lands were specifically excluded from the post-World War II UN decolonization regime by the Saltwater Thesis. These were the hard rights that states, especially colonial settler states, resist most fiercely. Rights here in the chart I delineate into hard and soft categories in order to not only demonstrate the classes, but also to draw out state responses to them. Since hard rights strike at some important fundamentals of the existing system of states, like land, territory, sovereignty, and self-determination. And because Indigenous groups were presenting and pushing for certain rearticulations of these concepts, I term them hard rights in order to indicate both the difficulty in negotiation, but also to expose their perceived threat to the hard core of the international system, state sovereignty. Soft rights, such as the rights to culture, language, education, and religion, are merely collective rights extensions of existing human rights. So while recognition and protection of soft rights involves some change to thinking about the inclusion of collective rights in the international system and how collective rights can complement and not push out individual rights, the changes required by states to secure these rights is not as fundamental as the changes brought forward by the hard rights, and thus the majority of states accept soft rights much more easily. But global Indigenous rights and politics exert a particular pressure on the international system to accept some kind of new, non-state-centric interpretation of self-determination, and therefore leading a shift in the meaning of self-determination. So, as I said earlier, the real potential for global change with Indigenous rights lies in how we go about implementing them. Implementing them necessitates significant change on the international and domestic level on a state-by-state basis. It calls for a reordering, a rethinking of sovereignty. It expects states to enact and implement some sort of legal, constitutional, legislative, and policy changes that can accommodate and respect not just the soft rights, but also the hard rights: land, free, prior, and informed consent, redress, self-government, autonomy, and other political sovereignty arrangements. The UN Declaration, if implemented in this way, can be read as a very early, incredibly nascent articulation of an entirely new international order, a new way of living, a new way of being in the world. Instead of hierarchical orders that include domination, extraction, and exploitation and colonial control, Indigenous rights, for the most part, though not exclusively, have been articulated by Indigenous political actors and could potentially be on the cutting edge of a radically new order, based on actually Indigenous principles, viewpoints, and ontologies of mutual respect, sustainability, reciprocal relationships, and the ongoing negotiation of even challenging political questions. In the discipline of international relations, where I've had my training, especially in the area of human rights, we study norms, both legal and societal norms. We study not only what norms exist and how they came to exist, but we also examine how they emerge, how they diffuse, how they evolve, how states become socialized, and how various political actors react to them. So now another graphic taken from my book related to norms. The international relations norm literature has not yet considered in its 35 years of existence the possibility of fundamental transnormative shift away from what we all know as state-centric norm space, or in the book I call norm plane A, to a new norm space, norm plane B. Such a shift from one to the other represents an entirely new form and means of doing politics and of organizing politically. This is the post-colonial completion project of the remnant colonial structures and practices still evident in norm plane A. In the book, I argue that the nature of global indigenous rights in politics is dual. It operates on the one hand to seek equality within the existing order, but at the same time, it's serving as a norm vector, moving us from one plane to another. And the second category of more difficult, problematic, hard indigenous rights norms and the new way of doing politics present fundamental challenges to the existing order. And they are so fundamental that they break through the constraints of norm plane A and begin to reach toward a future imagining of B. But let me pause, because before I get too celebratory, I have to recognize that nation states, especially wealthy and powerful ones, are obviously heavily invested in the current order. And while there was near global consensus and original votes for and then later endorsements for the UN Declaration, at least rhetorically, states can be expected in their actual behavior to be highly recalcitrant in their acceptance of the full body of indigenous rights, which will necessarily mean altering old ways of doing things. As several of my book chapters demonstrate, there are some what I call strange and unexpected patterns of state behavior in indigenous rights, especially and particularly among English-speaking settler states. And when I say strange and unexpected, I'm speaking in terms of international relations, human rights, and compliance literatures. And I'll just take a moment to highlight a couple examples from the book. The first one that I discover is a pattern that I term selective endorsement. What this means. Well, after originally voting against the UN Declaration in 2007, the 4 countries of what I also call the Anglosphere, meaning Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, each later shifted their official positions on the Declaration to support or endorsement in 2009 and 2010. Each one of these 4 countries included important qualifiers and exclusions about how the Declaration is to be interpreted. And far from a full endorsement of indigenous rights, these 4 countries collectively engaged in a much more nuanced behavior. I find that by selectively endorsing indigenous rights, these 4 attempted to express rhetorical support while also rather strategically, collectively, and globally unilaterally writing down the consensus on indigenous rights and constraining them so that current laws, policies, and practices automatically align with their interpretation of the human rights consensus. Second, a similar but related concept of overcompliance, and that's always in quotes. In this chapter of the book, I look at global patterns of state compliance with indigenous rights. And while the literature in compliance normally considers only a compliant, non-compliant calculation, my analysis opens that up and considers 5 possible outcomes in indigenous rights compliance by states. So I call them compliance, non-compliance, undercompliance, partial compliance, and then this new concept that I call overcompliance. 4 states are overcompliant, and you can guess them: the United States, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. An overcompliant state is one that on the one hand takes constitutional, legal, and policy actions that recognize specific rights or a category of rights that go beyond that state's obligations and go beyond its normative commitments. The term gets a little bit confusing because it does not indicate that such states are completely complying with or exceeding the standards. They are not. It means that the states are performing above the level of their commitments and obligations, which they deliberately keep low. It's a very nuanced behavior that, like selective endorsement, keeps these countries' expectations low enough so that they can interpret the status quo as already being in line with Indigenous rights. And then finally, as I elaborated on earlier, Indigenous rights seek to strike at the heart of colonial legal doctrines, which unfortunately are still valid law in settler state contexts. I should say, in many settler state contexts. Bottom line is that states, especially colonial settler states, fear Indigenous rights. States feel they must contain, they must control, and they must limit the rights of Indigenous peoples, or some sort of chaotic atmosphere will erupt. States often act as if Indigenous peoples and Indigenous rights are some kind of direct threat to their existence, and so they need to oppose them. But it doesn't need to be this way. It is only the old colonial doctrines, the old practices, the old discourses, and the old ways of doing business that have to be eradicated and redesigned. Because Indigenous rights essentially call for a restructuring of Indigenous state relationships and expect states to enact changes that can accommodate such things as Indigenous land rights, free, prior, and informed consent, and self-government, treaty relationships, plural sovereignty, and other imagined political arrangements. The implementation challenges before all of us are to imagine, to create, to rethink, to renegotiate systems and institutions. How can we find innovative reconstructions of our systems? How can we create new institutions that honor treaties fairly, that respect the rights of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples? How can we work out reasonable and equitable power sharing and resource sharing arrangements? We can fully expect that such a subtle nonviolent revolution is likely a very lengthy one, and it needs to be a very thoughtful one. Several possible implementation avenues present themselves, which I consider as two paths: institutional remedies and active deployment. I see active deployment as embodying the Declaration's dual legal and political character. Implementing the Declaration through institutional remedies, or the legal path, involves utilizing existing systems and structures on both the international and domestic levels to enhance rights protections for Indigenous peoples. Each one of these remedies offers a particular advancement in Indigenous rights protections, but we have to note, each one also comes with a set of attendant limitations that must be very carefully considered, especially in light of creative and constantly evolving state resistance to Indigenous rights in favor of the status quo. The active deployment path is, in my view, where the real potential lies to eventually move to a higher stage of implementation. Active deployment means invoking Indigenous rights principles in domestic and transnational political and social movements and conversations, as well as political and social discourses. Over time, Indigenous rights, just like other major social movements, civil rights, the end of slavery, just to name a few, lead us to the need to restructure and renegotiate in light, simply as they become taken for granted new assumptions. In the past little more than a year, we could say 13 months, we've seen massive movement in active deployment of Indigenous rights in Canada. In June 2015, only 13 months ago, the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued its summary report, which included 94 sweeping calls to action. What surprised many of us was those calls to action are actually firmly grounded in the discourse of international Indigenous rights, and firmly grounded in a renewal of nation-to-nation relationships between the Canadian government and Indigenous peoples. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission called for nothing short than the full adoption and full implementation of the UN Declaration in Canada. Over last summer, beginning in July, and up to the October federal election, Indigenous rights and the UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights played a surprisingly significant role in the campaign. And that is a campaign that I should note brought a record number of Indigenous voters to the ballot box over any previous federal election. In many ridings, the Indigenous vote was enough to decide the election. So Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, now Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and his Liberal Party promised from the beginning of the election a new relationship with Indigenous peoples, a respectful one, based on a nation-to-nation relationship, and from the beginning of his campaign, also pledged full implementation of the UN Declaration in Canada. Then, just 2 months ago, at the United Nations Permanent Forum in New York, Indigenous Affairs Minister Carolyn Bennett officially announced that Canada was going to be removing all of its permanent objector status to the UN Declaration and promised to fully implement it in Canada under this government. So while so far most of these pledges and promises are admittedly rhetorical, and I can certainly speak for many Indigenous peoples in Canada to say that we are still waiting to see results of all of these promises, it does appear, and I have to acknowledge, that this could be a critical shifting moment. I detect a normative shift toward Indigenous rights as both a moral assumption and a political responsibility. And this seems to be a normative shift that, at least rhetorically, is well underway. And in my view, we have to see where we take it from here and what sort of future relationship we can all design together. But as I say, the potential of Indigenous rights lies in their very potential. And so with that, I would say, Chi Miigwech, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak.